Hi everyone, we're just giving it another minute and we will be starting shortly, just whilst we wait for people to join. Well, hi everybody, good afternoon and welcome to the second event in Chemonics' UK Climate, Conflict and Capital Workshop series. I'm Eleanor Tuck, I'm the practice lead for climate sector engagement and climate, and I'm really delighted that you've joined us today for this session. So yes, I work for Chemonics, and for 50 years, Chemonics has worked in the world's most complex environments, and we've learned that the greatest challenges require integrated solutions. So the intersection of climate, conflict, and capital is where our teams work every day, from mobilising private investment and building climate resilience in fragile contexts to supporting peace-building initiatives. We're focusing on this intersection because traditional siloed approaches simply aren't enough. When we separate climate action from conflict resolution, or disconnect both from capital flows, we miss critical opportunities for lasting impact and sometimes inadvertently create new problems. Energy poverty and conflict are deeply intertwined. Of the 685 million people globally without electricity access, 8 out of 10 live in fragile, conflict-affected regions, while 19 of the top 25 most climate-vulnerable countries are fragile or conflict-affected. In fact, the IMF estimates that 59% of the world's extremely poor will live in fragile and conflict-affected situations by 2030. Climate finance, however, is still failing the most vulnerable, and despite representing some of the most climate vulnerable regions globally, analysis suggests that the 10 most fragile states receive less than 1% of total global climate finance flows, according to 2021 figures. So the question is whether we can shape the green transition to build stability and economic opportunity rather than perpetuate harm, particularly in fragile and climate vulnerable contexts. Thankfully, today we have a great panel of experts with us to help address these difficult questions, and I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague Benedikt, who's the Managing Director of Luvent, part of the Chemonics family of companies. He's going to introduce the panel and guide us through what promises to be a vital conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Al, for this thought-provoking introduction, setting the stage for today's webinar. As I said, my name is Benedikt Pollmeier-Aletras. I'm Managing Director at Luvent Consulting here in Berlin, and we are part of the Chemonics group of companies. Maybe just a couple of words about Luvent and setting the scene for today's webinar before introducing the panel. At Luvent Consulting, we're working on innovative solutions to support the global green transition, and we take an integrative and holistic approach to these global challenges. We believe that long-term, there is no trade-off between economic growth and social and environmental sustainability. I believe sustainability and resilience depend on our abilities to internalize externalities, set smart incentives and regulations, and invest in innovation. We see this not just as an ethical imperative, but really as a strategy necessary for a stable, thriving future. And how do we do this in Luvent? We have an approach to really facilitate digital transformation at various levels. We're supporting private sector development from entrepreneurship, employment, youth employment, innovation supporting, and government advisory. And we're supporting stakeholders worldwide on climate action. So therefore, I'm particularly delighted to moderate today's session. Today, we focus on one of the most urgent, promising, but also complex challenges of global development, I believe, greening value chains, strategies for climate and conflict resilience. So just Briefly, these value chains cover extraction of critical materials such as cobalt, lithium, rare earth elements, etc., manufacturing and assembling renewable energy infrastructure like solar panels, batteries, wind turbines, etc., deploying these technologies at scale, and expanding decentralized energy access off-grid, fragile or underdeserved region. The value chains are essentially the backbone of the global net zero ambition and the sustainable climate compatible transformation that we're seeking. And yet a lot of these value chains are deeply embedded in fragile contexts. So they are often rooted in political instability, weak institutions. They face severe limitations in access to finance, social injustice and exclusion, as well as asymmetric social impacts. So benefiting more developed regions, and those in underdeveloped regions face strongest social disadvantages because of these value chains. This leads to two fundamental principles of the fragility undermines reliability. So the whole green energy value chain is rooted in fragile and conflict-affected contexts and becomes inherently volatile. Political instability, weak governance, and limited infrastructure can make these systems unreliable and putting the resilience of the global green transition itself at risk. And the second dimension, I believe, is that the value chains can drive fragility themselves, because poorly designed green value chains have a destabilizing effect on the region, further exacerbating inequality, triggering land disputes, sparking violence. And these impacts ripple outwards beyond the green value chains for energy and creating a destabilized region and threatening global stability. And so that's why I'm particularly happy to have today's conversation, as it's really urgent and important, not just in the development consulting sector, but more broadly. Fortunately, I'm joined by a fantastic panel of experts that offers a multidimensional perspective on the complex challenges, possesses extensive experience in deploying such solutions in many different forms. We will begin with Anna Bittman, sharing insights from our Iraq project on how greening value chains work in practice in conflict-affected contexts. We then move to Pavel Tereshchenko, who will then explore the broader benefits and opportunities that greening value chains can unlock, including in conflict reduction. We speak to Megan Sager, who will dive into the critical questions of mobilizing finance and innovative instruments to make this transformation possible. And finally, Linda Wamune will bring us practical case studies of financing approaches in conflict-affected states, drawing from her vast experience in Africa. We'll speak around 45 minutes with our panelists on those questions. Then we will open the floor for discussion. Please feel free to submit your questions via the chat through HUD. It should be open as of now. Then let's start with Anna Bittman. She's led the Durable Communities and Economic Opportunities program in Iraq for Chemonics. It's a flagship program driving donor-funded initiatives for sustainable, local-led solutions, including solar power maintenance training for SMEs in Mosul. Anna, can you tell us about your experience in Iraq? How has greening the value chain intersected with fragility and post-conflict states?
Thank you so much, Benedikt. I'm really excited to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited for this timely discussion. As Benedikt mentioned, my background is in program implementation. I worked most recently on the Durable Communities and Economic Opportunities project. So that project was implemented in the country of Iraq, where I've lived for the past decade, and I had the privilege of working at the intersection of strategy and implementation, and this project, which focused on sustainable, locally led solutions. And as has been mentioned during this event already, we worked at the intersection of economic development and community stabilization. So there's a lot to share here about how greening the value chains can affect local conflict dynamics. I'm really happy to be able to share lessons from the country of Iraq. There's a lot of challenges and opportunities. And over the past several years, DCEO, the project I worked on, addressed conflict drivers through climate smart solutions or greening the value chains. While my examples today will come from that context because it's where I worked for more than a decade, the lessons can definitely be applied more broadly. I'll go over the context quickly, it's going to sound very familiar to a lot of you, and then talk in depth about a couple of interventions that we did that I think showcase the potential for these type of activities. So familiar context: climate change is accelerating, rising temperatures, prolonged droughts, and increasing water scarcity. By some rankings, Iraq is the 5th most vulnerable country in the world to climate change. Economic fragility persists with high youth unemployment and heavy reliance on oil revenues. Now, this results in simple terms in resource competition, whether for water, energy, arable land, which fuels tension at the community level. And when we can introduce successfully climate smart technologies and practices, we can help reduce these pressures. So in my experience, yes, greening value chains can contribute to reducing conflict in fragile contexts, but only when interventions are grounded in the local realities, designed for long-term sustainability, and present a strong business case for potential participants. So, as we said, it's possible, but it's not automatic. Greening value chains can only support peace if local capacity is identified and supported, and solutions are tailored to the context. So let's start with local capacity. Every project that we did on DCEO started by working with the communities where we were present. So at DCEO, we've shown that local capacity is the linchpin for making climate smart intervention effective and sustainable in conflict affected areas. So we have always started by co-designing solutions with our local partners, whether those are business owners, community leaders, or local organizations, sometimes all of the above. Interventions, therefore, are relevant and they're owned by the people who will ultimately sustain them. Training and technical assistance were always a critical part of that approach. And in Mosul, as Benedikt mentioned, we established a solar power maintenance training program at a local vocational training center. I'll talk more about this activity in a little bit, but this enabled us to engage with the critical local value chain with small and medium enterprises, greening that value chain and reducing conflict. I'll talk more also about how this activity had a long-term impact by working with a wide variety of local stakeholders. So if we travel to conflict-affected contexts anywhere in the world, you're looking at a high degree of informality. And if we look at the solar power intervention that we did in Iraq, we came to that as a result of engagement with the economic development problems in that country. And if you look at the context, we look at the small and medium enterprises of Iraq. Now, those form the backbone of Iraqi communities. 95% of businesses in Iraq are small and medium enterprises, and of those, the vast majority are small and informal. They are the backbone of Iraqi communities, particularly outside of the country's urban centers, and they rely on a mixture of electricity sources. It is due to the unreliability of the national grid, they have to have either personal generators if they can afford them, or tap into neighborhood and other local schemes to access electricity. Sounds inefficient, excuse me, because it is, and it's also very expensive. So why have these businesses not adopted solar? And on the surface, these are all perfect candidates. Well, DCEO looked into solar power and renewable energy writ large in Iraq. And we started with a really high-level approach that examined investment facilitation opportunities in the solar sector. And we were looking first with our DCEO team at commercial and industrial solar. And as a part of the study that we did, we collected a lot of information about the perspectives and the motivations of Iraqi consumers on the technology. And so people in Iraq were familiar. There were really low levels of trust and an unwillingness to invest in the technology. Of course, due to a lack of access to finance in the context, any individual or business owner that wanted to have solar power would have to make 100% of the capital expenditure upfront and would need to therefore have a high level of trust and belief in the technology and an understanding of the impacts that it would have. So we knew that we had to overcome this intervention, a trust deficit, and we looked at micro enterprises as a potential way of doing that on the ground. We worked in the city of Mosul, where we thought that we could think of micro enterprises and greening value chains as setting up with kind of a demonstration plot for the small businesses there. And so we set up a number of micro enterprises there with solar power, ranging from carpentry shops to, I believe there was a couple of tailoring businesses as well. These businesses in exchange for receiving technical assistance from the project, then held information sessions and demonstration sessions for other business owners and just interested individuals in their areas. Not only does it overcome the knowledge deficit, but it also helped overcome the trust deficit, because while there was an interest and a knowledge of these green technologies, there was there were a lot of questions in people's minds about whether this was the right solution for them and whether this would actually work in their particular context. Overall, overwhelmingly, our intervention found that business owners were not only able to greatly reduce and almost eliminate their electricity costs, they were also able to work longer hours. So they were having less costs while also generating more revenue. It's pretty easy to see how they would become strong local advocates for the technology. And as a part of this, we looked not only at the small and medium enterprise value chain, but we also looked at what we would need to do to operate these solar panels for all these businesses and for interested residents in the long term. And our team identified a gap in the market when it came to the skills and knowledge to operate solar power equipment sustainably. These skills and knowledge were not automatically available, although there are an increasing number of individuals who have these skills and companies that are starting. It's a really exciting time and context. We also worked with the local Directorate of Labor and Social Affairs and their vocational training center to add a course in solar panel installation to their local vocational training center in Mosul, as well as maintenance, so that people could access this training and then hopefully become the technicians for this burgeoning sector. So, as Benedikt mentioned, business and sustainability need not be a contradiction. There are huge amounts of opportunity in this area, and it was a really exciting project. We not only worked in Mosul, but we worked with vocational training centers in several other areas of the country. Another activity on the other end of the country in southern Iraq that we did worked with a different issue. This was working with date farmers, once the largest export from the country. Date farmers in Iraq are facing a lot of challenges. In the southern governorate of Basra, the major challenges is both the quality and the quantity of water that's available. The water is not only less available, but it's also increasingly high in salinity, which means that farmers need to adapt. And unfortunately, adapting is expensive and it involves changing practices that have been held in many cases for generations. And so what you see a lot of the time in southern Iraq right now is farmers choosing to leave their land, selling their land to individuals who are moving out of cities, or as urban areas expand, farms are sold and transformed into housing. Unfortunately, when this happens, farmers and their families move into urban areas. They predominantly reside in informal settlements, and they compete for very limited jobs. And they put a lot of pressure on urban areas, already overstretched public services. So it's a negative cycle, and seeing what we could do to support the farmers in these areas was really critical for us to help make sure that we could not only support the conflict dynamics, but as a result, green the date value chain. And what we ended up doing in the Basra governorate, we supported a number of farmers, again, with our demonstration plot model, in this case, actually on the farms. We were really looking at how we could help them implement some very simple technology adaptations, climate smart adaptations that would allow them to reduce the amount of water they needed, but also more successfully adapt to the salinity reality of their primary water source. And so we did that through a combination of locally available technologies, again, set up demonstration plots in exchange for the recipients holding sessions and becoming what we called farmer innovators, or leaders in their community for these new climate smart technologies. So from these activities, you can see the major themes of our interventions. First of all, locally led. We prioritize identifying and supporting the capacity of local trainers, technicians, and institutions. Local expertise must remain in the community even after our direct involvement ends. And I mentioned earlier, we've had a lot of exciting long-term impacts of these projects. And one of the effects and the long-term outputs from our solar power intervention was that the National Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs in Iraq was able to develop their own curriculum for solar installation and solar panel operation and maintenance. And they were able to do that because our assistance included training for staff throughout the country. We were not the only actor doing that, but we were the only ones who also provided in-kind technical assistance and training equipment for these vocational training centers that enabled them to create a practical guide with illustrations and photos of real equipment available on the market, but how to use these, how to work them, and what common issues and maintenance needs were for the equipment in the market in Iraq. So that was really exciting. That curriculum was certainly something that we're really hopeful about seeing impact from in the future. I also want to emphasize how important it is that these types of activities are integrated with economic incentives. I think some of my fellow panelists will touch on this more, but a major issue to the adoption of this technology at the ground level is, of course, access to financing. It's clear in any of these contexts. And then finally, we, of course, maintain sensitivity to local conflict dynamics. This started with ensuring that our teams were from the communities that they were working in, but continued with conducting regular conflict assessments and analyses to make sure that we were up to date on the ground. So overall, to return to the question as a whole, I think, is it wishful thinking to believe that greening value chains can reduce conflict? From my perspective, no. Definitely not wishful thinking, but it does require vision, it requires partnership, and it requires the commitment to local leadership. So at the Durable Communities and Economic Opportunities Project, we have seen firsthand how climate-smart interventions that green value chains can help communities move towards greater resilience and stability. And I'm really excited to hear more from our other panelists. Benedikt, back to you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna, and exactly on point with the time as well. Yeah, really interesting to hear the concrete examples on how green value chains can actually put into action and can work practically. No simple solution, but very clear messages on how to translate it into action. Turning now to Pavel Tereshchenko, who joined us from the UN Energy Team for Sustainable Energy for All. Pavel drives green industrialization initiatives, including the African Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative, supports the Council for Critical Mineral Development in the Global South, and Regional Green Value Chains Project in Southeast Asia. Pavel, how can green value chains be a driver for inclusive socio-economic development and job creation in developing countries, thereby contributing to stability and prosperity?
Thank you so much, Benedikt, and thank you very much to Chemonics for inviting Sustainable Energy for All to contribute to this discussion. And I'm very happy that Anna went before me, because I could not agree more that local is the central aspect of this discussion, right? We don't have it in the name, but I think that the focus on the local value chains is critical. So let me just give you a brief, maybe a few words about Sustainable Energy for All in principle. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are basically a custodian organization of SDG 7. We're part of the United Nations family, and we're hosted by UNOPS. So to speak about green value chains, I'd like in my intervention kind of zoom out a little bit, right, and look at the broader question, right? So how do we ensure that the green value chains are improving livelihoods of people on ground, and regardless of the conflict situation, because we see green value chains as the tool much larger than just addressing the conflict environments. And really echoing Anne at the starting point of it all is the focus on local value chains, because even if we consider the existing global economic model, right, the focus has been really on the extractive mode of existence, with the resources, right, taken from one place, processed in another, and then profits were concentrated far from the source. And I think that in the discussion that we're having right now, this is absolutely important, because this was the foundation of something that is called the resource curse, that left many communities with environmental damage and with little to non-economic benefit, sometimes even sowing, right, the seeds of the very conflict. So if our green transition simply replaces our dependency on fossils with another dependency, right, but this time on green technologies, this, in our opinion, is a historic missed opportunity, leaving many countries and communities in the global south behind once again. So that's why we should focus on both green transition and local opportunity. So let me give you a kind of concrete example what this localization looks like on ground. We recently analyzed the opportunity for localizing solar PV assembly in Nigeria. And Nigeria is a perfect case study for this because it's a nation of immense human and solar resources. However, it's currently importing most of the solar PV modules, right? So in 2024, the country imported solar PV modules worth around 154 million US dollars. And every single one of these modules was fully assembled abroad, right? That means zero local value addition, zero local jobs in manufacturing, and complete reliance on the global supply chains that had proven to be quite fragile in the most recent developments. So now let's take a look at the future, right? That's what Nigeria is currently importing. And we know from historic data that the imports had been on the rise over the past few years as well. And if Nigeria follows its own ambitious energy transition plan, which SEforALL was very proud to co-develop, the country is targeting net zero by 2060. Under this plan, the demand for solar PV is set to explode as it becomes the backbone of the country's energy mix for electricity. And in this scenario, cumulative imports, right, keep in mind the 154 million USD in 2024, by 2035, the cumulative imports could be 5 billion US dollars. And by 2060, the year of net zero, the amount of inputs would be cumulatively 27 billion US dollars. And imagine that literally river of capital flowing out of the country. And now, if we are to localize just 50% of the already existing demand for solar PV modules by 2035, which is about 2.5 gigawatts, the impact on domestic market alone, right? So we're not considering export opportunities. The impact would be truly transformative. We're talking about 2.7 million person days of employment created for real people on ground, right, who are facing harsh realities of living through the effects of climate change like no others. We're talking about 560 million US dollars of direct value addition from local assembly being captured inside Nigeria and not sent abroad. And in order to fuel this, the country would face 250 million US dollars of new investments flowing into the local economy, right, to facilitate creation of this local assembly capacity. So crucially, this means more resilient energy infrastructure that doesn't buckle under global shocks, whether it's pandemic, trade dispute, shipping crisis, and that benefits people on ground. So these are some of the numbers to keep in mind as we're speaking about why local green value chains is so important in the global south. The next logical step for green value chains is to move from this high-level assembly to manufacturing components, right? Then we can be speaking about mounting structures for solar PV, cables, inverters, aluminum frames, copper wiring, lamination, and others. And this is just for solar PV. So imagine the opportunities that we have in other green sectors, whether it's critical minerals, extraction, electric vehicles, wind turbines. So there are many, many other places where this all still holds. And these value chains, right, they create even more skilled jobs in countries that often lack them. And then once we have the local production of, let's say, solar PV panels, we can then deploy let's say, mini grids that are assembled locally that can keep lights on a clinic, right, when the national grid fails, allowing small businesses to run refrigerators, farmers to use irrigation pumps, and even, allow children to study at night. So this creates the socio-economic opportunities from the ground up through green industrialization. And that's about building a system that is inherently more robust and less prone to the shocks. But unlocking these opportunities requires a lot of things, and international policy frameworks and strong partnerships are fundamental here. And that's where we add and contribute to this as sustainable energy for all. So we've been working closely with governments and regional partners to develop detailed green manufacturing policy and investment guides. We currently have these for countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana. And these are practical, consolidated overviews of the policy and fiscal landscape relevant for green technology specifically to attract investment and empower local entrepreneurs. And this is very important because sometimes, Anna already mentioned finance, and in a lot of cases, the people who want to invest in, let's say, manufacturing in Africa, they lack understanding of how the policy landscape looks in a given country. And sometimes the perceived risks are significantly higher than the real risks on the ground, which then exacerbates the problem of the lack of funding for these projects. But it's not only about giving the high-level overviews that is needed. In Nigeria, we're also taking it a step further, and we're currently working on a detailed solar PV localization roadmap, where that involves mapping exactly how policy and industrial incentives can unlock not just assembly, but also local components and industrial system integration for solar PV, ingot and wafer creation, cell fabrication, and silicon processing, right? And these discussions must be very precise if we really want to advance the local green value chains. We need to answer questions like, what does it take for a local producer of standard AC cables to retool their factory to produce specialized DC cables needed for solar modules? And that's the granular practical work that can really move the needle in advancing local green value chains. And that's why we believe that it's super important for us to be having this discussion. But another aspect to this is that it's not really about individual countries acting alone. To be truly beneficial and competitive, the value chains, they need to be locally rooted, but they must reach beyond national borders. And that's why, as a part of our work, we're supporting South African G20 presidency in advancing the concept of green industrialization hubs, because these are the regional platforms that are designed to foster collaboration, technology transfer, joint ventures, and really cross-border supply chains. It's unrealistic to speak in a modern economy about, putting the entire value chain within one country, but we can ensure that locally rooted value chains, green value chains, can then contribute to a shared product and create stronger regional bonds that in the conflict-related scenarios could potentially reduce the likelihood of conflict breaking out in the first place. So in conclusion, I know that there are a lot of things that I've mentioned so far, right? The partnerships, the necessity to focus on the local aspect and put some numbers that these opportunities can bring, using Nigeria as an example. Just to summarize it all, we believe that, echoing Anna previously, that green value chains must be rooted in domestic opportunities and ownership to really capture value and create jobs. They must be integrated. They must use what's already existing in country, ensuring that what you're creating nicely fits into the existing production lines and benefiting from the existing, from the already available resource in the country, and then rooted in regional partnerships to ensure that you can achieve scale, you can foster collaboration, and ensure long-term stability. So with that being said, I'm very excited to hear from other speakers, and we must ensure that as we create stronger, more equitable, and more peaceful economies, we have it all rooted locally. Thank you so much. Back to you, Benedikt.
Thank you so much, Pavel. It's been really interesting also to hear the two dimensions, and echoing Anna's words on the focus on local value chains and how you see opportunities for countries like Nigeria to escape the threat of, or the reality of, the green energy value chains turning into the modern version of the Dutch disease, and actually helping creating jobs, resilience, independence, and prosperity. And the PV work in Nigeria that you described is a really powerful example for it. And then, of course, linking it back to global value chain connectedness and importance of cross-border trade and facilitating exchanges between localized value chains. Thank you so much, Pavel. More than pleased now to be joined by Megan Sager, founder of Sustainable Solutions. Megan structures innovative financial instruments to close the climate finance gap and serves as a lead analyst for Africa at the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. Megan, what are the financing mechanisms that you see as most applicable to conflict-affected and fragile states?
Yeah, thank you very much, Benedikt. So in previous work that we've undertaken for a collective of VFIs, including with Chemonics involvement, we've really identified that there are at least 3 key investment opportunities in green value chains. This analysis was rooted in Africa specifically. The first one is in piloting critical minerals rich clean technology. So in fact, while there has been quite significant venture capital activity in Africa since 2020, post-COVID, it has been quite heavily concentrated in fintech and other kind of high-tech opportunities with very little focus on manufacturing of product locally, so limited innovation in the clean technology product space. And essentially, we see that that even the VC funding that has been circulating has been falling off significantly in the last 2 years as the world has moved into a more kind of risk-averse space. So the first opportunity that we see is investing in manufacturing technology using critical minerals, recognizing in particular where the localization opportunities are midstream and downstream, and taking a longer term view on how these technologies can become competitive. So we've got to recognize that a lot of the downstream opportunities are really dependent on innovation on the continent or in countries with critical minerals. And that's essentially what sows the seed for development of these value chains over time. So by the time that a technology is commoditized, generally speaking, it is cheaper and more efficient to do it offshore in many Eastern countries than what is competitive to deliver on in Africa. So I think the first opportunity really strikes me as one that is a good fit for sovereign wealth funds. So we have some sovereign wealth funds on the continent in countries like Botswana and Nigeria that have been well endowed with oil and gas or diamonds. And this is really a way for them to start reshaping the value chains on the continent. The second one is a more commercially driven opportunity that will take kind of a medium term to materialize. And this focuses on partnering with private equity firms. So at the moment, private equity firms are mostly focused on infrastructure investments where cash flows are more certain, where they can secure long-term demand. But essentially, the opportunity here is looking at where the pockets exist with scaling potential. So for example, electric motorbikes in East Africa, which are taking off very rapidly as a replacement for combustion engine motorcycles, looking at how to scale up these businesses that have backwards integration opportunities in the value chain. So essentially dealing with a key source of demand, which is the market size, through stimulating the market and supporting commercially viable technologies. The third one is focusing on greening of the value chain. So this is really about the energy supply into the critical minerals value chain, and it's largely about kind of which energy sources are being used within mining and processing of minerals. And this is really around how to reach many of these countries that are often in conflict-affected countries, and it's around partnering with corporates to provide that long-term demand stability, which enables project financing. So thinking both around the cash flows and then thinking about the de-risking, which we'll deal with separately. So then as we start to think about some of the critical issues that affect investing in this space, something that has emerged as a significant barrier to unlocking the true potential of this space is the difference in horizons between where capital is concentrated and where it is needed. So today, the dominant investment kind of paradigm involves a horizon of roughly 5 to 10 years. So this is where payback periods allow investments in rooftop solar for C&I applications, electric motorbikes, for example. So these are, very bankable, well-known investments, palatable to the large majority of private investors. And really all that they depend on is enabling regulation. So they're bankable really without too much significant development finance institution or other public incentives and support. The second key opportunity moves us deeper into the growth of the value chain, and that's around creating the enabling infrastructure for value chains to exist. So in many parts of the continent where critical minerals are located, there simply is insufficient energy infrastructure, logistics infrastructure to enable proper beneficiation of these minerals and processing to take place. And because of the significant public goods component associated with infrastructure, it's also often infeasible for the private sector to undertake this alone. So there's more often than not a kind of PPP dimension to this. What's really critical in this case is to have offtake certainty, so to have an anchor source of demand in the region that can commit to long-term offtake to justify the investment. This is often a sovereign or a utility, and then patient capital for the subordinated tranches. So picking up the longer term tranches of investment, so 12, 15, 20 years, that would generally fall to DFIs, but it could also be investment by pension funds and other longer dated investors. So we're starting to see this certainly in more sophisticated economies like South Africa, where the benefits of longer dated investments have been recognized by investors that now see infrastructure as its own asset class. And then the third one and most crucial one for just transition on the continent is really an investment focused on local economic transformation. So this sounds like something that government should be exclusively involved in, but it's really about reimagining what communities and value chains look like in countries with critical minerals or countries around these, clustered around these areas. And it's thinking about how we give rise to value chains that are new and that can give the continent new sources of competitive advantage. So a good example would be green hydrogen in South Africa and Namibia, where industrial policy is developing around these new opportunities and laying foundations for new sources of production to kind of buoy up the country's economy as energy transition takes place globally. So what is important in this case is really to have an aligned policy position and where possible incentives in the form of special economic zones to catalyze longer term investment, and then essentially to build procurement opportunities around these special economic zones to enable economies of scale. So this is really the most critical one, and I think we see this missing in many critical mineral rich contexts where volatile economies and governments tend to push us back into short time horizons. And I think it's really critical for us all on this call to advocate for these longer term measures, without which it's very unlikely that green value chains will develop. So just talking very practically about some de-risking mechanisms for conflict affected areas, which we've said are the worst affected, and these big mineral rich jurisdictions. The first one is around the revenue profile of projects in these areas. So this one is around revenue enhancement. So if we think about how investors make decisions, it's all about risk-adjusted return. So the higher the risk, the higher the return expectation by the investor. So in the first instance, it's thinking about the toolbox available to adjust the economics on the project. And one very clever example that Linda is going to be touching on today is how PREX creates a results-based financing mechanism to reward investors for taking the risk of developing energy infrastructure in conflict-affected places. Similarly, also registering carbon projects in these countries, sustainable carbon projects that benefit local communities and achieve gold standard or a similar certification would be another way to bring outcomes linked financing into these projects. And what this does is it enables project developers to achieve a position of over collateralization where they can go to the bank and ask for a certain volume of debt finance and be in a position where they can very comfortably achieve that and so drive down pricing or achieve better terms. Alternatively, it can also make them less reliant on debt in very risky jurisdictions where debt is super scarce or expensive. So that's the first one, and that's about project economics. The second one is really about dealing with what happens when you're dependent on revenue over 10, 15, 20 years, and that's around the certainty of your cash flows. So the second one there is around using guarantees. So these could be letters of credit, which are shorter-term liquidity-focused instruments, or they can be sovereign payments and offtake guarantees that provide project developers with certainty of demand and cash flows over a longer period of time. So this locks in the investment case, and that makes projects bankable when economic instability is a factor that comes into investment decisions. So in this case, you might have a relatively stable government and only localized pockets of conflict. So this is, much of East Africa, for example, but you might have uncertain economic prospects undermining long-term investment horizons. So this is the type of mechanism that could be used to attract investors in this case. And then the last one, the policy shield. So this is once all the structural measures have been baked into the investor mechanism to protect the investor and make sure that their business case is sound. Ultimately, this political risk insurance can be deployed as a way to protect investors from any adverse political events that take place during the investment period. So this could include risk of expropriation, currency inconvertibility, which means essentially being unable to take currency out of a country, the government breach of contract, or the non-honoring of sovereign obligations. And this is really important in many of these conflict-affected areas where political volatility is a driver of low investment. So just to kind of conclude my discussion today, I think it's really important for us to think about the role of development banks. So Africa's development finance institutions and development finance institutions elsewhere in the continent. And they can play a really, really important role in catalyzing green value chains, in particular playing 5 critical functions. So the first one is around anchoring investment in strategic infrastructure. So co-financing green industrial parks, investing in grid upgrades, structuring PPPs for corridor development. So for example, the Cobalt Corridor in the DRC, or the upstream lithium projects in the Northern Cape in South Africa. And the second one is to de-risk private capital with blended finance. So we've spoken today about guarantees and political risk insurance, which can crowd in private equity and venture capital or other forms of private debt. The third one is around backing midstream and downstream value addition. So we spoke earlier on about the necessity of the public sector to take longer-term horizons and longer-term risk. So when we think about refining, manufacturing, and recycling opportunities, what we really want DFIs to do is to co-invest in strategic beneficiation facilities with off-take linked financing, also to fund technical feasibility studies and environmental assessments, and to support R&D and innovation. And then also to catalyze regional integration and to foster collaboration between sovereign wealth funds and global partners. So they sit in a unique place where they are able to play an important role in achieving better regional coordination on what ultimately extend beyond national imperatives. Thank you very much, Benedikt. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Megan. There was a huge depth of information, but also of information, especially on finance, but not only on the different actors that can support the financing of greening the value chains. You also touched upon actually the internalization of the externalities of producing the green value chain of the impact of renewable infrastructure and how it's produced, as well as the need for an enabling environment, policy and regulatory environment in order to facilitate financing into the green value chain in Africa and creating opportunities for localizing more value creation where the critical minerals are often based, notably in the global south. So thank you so much for this, Megan. Before we open for Q&As, we certainly don't want to forget to be joined by Linda Wamune from Energy Peace Partners, who brings over 17 years of experience in designing and implementing off-grid clean energy distribution programs across rural Africa. Linda currently oversees programs in Chad, Somalia, and other areas, and leads the work on the Peace Renewable Energy Credits, the PRECs that were just mentioned earlier. Linda, what can we learn from this PRECs as an example in the space, and from your experience in Africa and in conflict-affected states such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, especially?
Thank you, Benedikt. Before I answer that question, just let me take a step back and tell you a little bit about what we do at Energy Peace Partners. We are a non-profit and founded on the belief that renewable energy can serve as a critical building block for peace in some of these, world's most conflict-affected regions. And therefore, what we've done is gone ahead and developed an innovative financing scheme, as already mentioned previously, the Peace Renewable Energy Credit, which we use to incentivize clean energy markets to be able to support the building out of new projects in these regions. And so as an organization, we rely on what we call the International Tracking Standard Foundation to be able to extend this instrument because of a lack of local framework in a number of regions where we operate. And so we use the IREC, that is the International Renewable Energy Credit, as the instrument that we support in terms of creating these additional revenue flows to these conflict-affected regions. And what the roles that we play multiple roles because it's a market that we are trying to build and grow. It has not existed previously, but we see this as a very important channel and avenue to be able to de-risk investment in new projects in these locations. And so we serve as an issuer on the one hand, and that is enabling the ecosystem to be able to verify the generation of these credits. And on the other hand, we also play a critical role in developing the market itself in terms of educating clean energy buyers and letting them be aware that we have this instrument that you can use to be able to, over and above your emissions accounting, you also can use the same to incentivize the development of new projects. And so with that dual role and realizing that there's a lot of risk averseness when it comes to investing in projects in these conflict-affected states. And so using the PREC is we find that as a useful tool to be able to support this development. And why we do this is because we see an opportunity in many of these countries to be able to build peace. And we look at peace, in terms of positive peace building benefits. And that is now, when we think about economic opportunities that are unlocked when people have energy access, looking at improved health and, health outcomes or education, increased safety and security, creating what we call peace dividends. And so these become a deterrent to many of, especially young people that often have nothing to do. And once they are economically engaged, then we find that serves as a deterrent to engage, to conflict, and therefore helping to build what we call peace, positive peace. And on the other hand, by investing in renewables, we are also working towards discouraging the negative externalities. And this is, in interrupting some of the supply chains which conflict actors rely on. If you look at some countries like Somalia, for example, where charcoal value chains are very well established, and so being able to disrupt that can also serve as a deterrent to reducing the conflict cases. And so using the Peace Renewable Energy Credit, and what this instrument does is it's able to place a premium on a certificate, and this premium communicates the social core benefits that are derived by investing in renewables. And to date, we have been able to support development of new projects, unlocking close to $2 million in new investment. Corporates buy these instruments to be able to communicate and make claims of the use of renewables in the markets where they operate. And we find that, for example, in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where, as an example, earlier this year, the conflict situation was very, very critical. What happened with one of the projects that we supported, and this is a developer known as Nuru, in the eastern part of the DRC, a town called Goma. We have issued renewable energy credits from this project. And at that time, this mini grid was protected by the community, and it was able to serve as a critical example of how renewable energy can be able to support peace in such contexts. And with that, we are now developing a new instrument known as the Peace Renewable, the PIREC aggregation facility. And what this facility will do is it will be able to unlock, it's designed as an $11 million, my apologies. It's designed as an $11 million facility, which will be channeled to 14 countries, including the DRC. And what it will do is it will be able to support project developers with upfront financing, about 10% of project financing, upfront financing for projects. And with that, it will be able to serve as a de-risking instrument and unlock financing. And they're able to use this as an instrument where they can be able to go to their investors and be able to unlock the other investments that they require. And so using instruments like the Peace Renewable Energy Credit, we find that communities are able, we are able to support peace development in communities through this new investment in renewable energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Linda. Fantastic overview and really interesting to see the work that you've done. Also, bringing learnings to the broader context of ecosystem valuation, of actually showing credibility and supplementarity of the work and that is done in order to provide the credits. Similar work has already been tried a lot, and I remember my own master's thesis about the UN RED program on complementarity of protecting forest in the rainforest, and the difficulties in establishing de-risking in investment and the credit system. So thank you so much, Linda, for your inputs today. I would say now that we have given an overview of the background experiences of the panel speakers, I would go to Elle again to facilitate the question and answers.
Thanks, Benedikt, and thanks to the panel speakers for such interesting introductions to the topic and to what you're involved with. So just before I start asking the questions, do go to the Q&A tab in Teams and add your questions there. I think we're going to do it all through the Q&A tab on this particular webinar because we've got a lot of people on the call. But yeah, really keen to see some of your questions. So first off, we've got one here that says, we'll see who we ask this to, but it says for the panel, if you had to prioritize one intervention or change what's needed to accelerate greening of value chains in conflict affected areas, what would it be? And maybe we will start with Linda, because there's a bit for Linda. What are the barriers you've encountered and how have you overcome them? So let's start with you, Linda, if that's okay. Do you want me to repeat it, or are you good to go? You're on mute, Linda.
Often we have, in countries where we're expanding the peace renewable energy credits, this market hasn't existed before. And so we find that we have to do multiple roles when it comes to, first of all, engaging communities, engaging developers, speaking with them, educating them on the role and what, starting from the basics, what is a renewable energy credit? And on top of that, what is a peace renewable energy credit and how can it unlock financing for you? And on the other hand, we are also, working to grow the market. And so speaking with these corporates that buy these instruments, we've seen positive engagement with tech companies, for example, that have really supported this because of the critical minerals that they use in their components. And the third lever is government engagement, because for us to be able to have an instrument that is globally recognized, there has to be buy-in from the government. And so we find ourselves playing multiple roles to be able to unlock and develop these markets. And so partnerships are very critical because we do not have a physical presence in each of these locations. And so we rely a lot on the local partners to be able to help us, first of all, know if it's government engagement, we rely on local organizations that have very well established relationships with governments. And when it comes to market building, we also rely on advisory firms that have these connections with the corporates that are going to buy the instruments. And for us, with developers, we also engage with the sector associations to be able to access and be able to have and get access to the pool of project developers that are operating in each of these countries. And so for us, critical is the partnerships and partnership development to be able to open up the local avenues for us, and they know their communities better. When if it's developers, they know the issues that affect them locally, and communities are also able to be engaged to identify projects that can be supported, which they know are useful for economic development as well as peace building for their environments. And so we find that very critical in our work.
Thanks, Linda. Anna, I wonder if you also wanted to tackle this question about prioritising interventional change that's needed to accelerate greening of value chains in conflict-affected areas, realising that the theme of localisation and building partnerships with local organisations has come up kind of multiple times, I think, on this conversation already this afternoon. But over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Eleanor. I think that's a really interesting point, and it's something I wanted to highlight. When you talk about prioritizing interventions, I wouldn't necessarily choose one over another, but I would really look at the split here in the messaging that we have in our conversation here, and then the messaging that we were making when we're in the field working with local communities. And I would think it's really important to emphasize and to underline that program objectives, when we talk about climate-smart interventions, we talk about greening value chains, versus when we talk on the ground with community members, we are talking about bottom line impacts to their businesses overall. And so when it comes to prioritizing interventions, and when it comes to the ones where I think money and effort should be directed in the future, I really think that we should be looking at the ones that present the strongest business case, because I think that's where you're going to see the most momentum, you're going to see the most impact, and then you're going to be able to see these scaling up impacts as my other fellow panelists discussed. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. So I'm going to move to a different question to give others the opportunity to ask questions. This one is Boaz. And it says, what opportunities exist for sustainable sourcing and procurement in our value chains, and how can we leverage them? Pavel, I'm going to turn to you to try and tackle something on there. Sorry for putting you on the spot. Let's see how you get on.
No worries, Eleanor. Yeah, so I think, we don't really do sustainable sourcing and procurement and advice on this, but from the discussions that we're having in this space in general, I would say that when it comes to opportunities, it's really about seeing what do you want to do. If you're really wanting to make it an economic case, or rather business case, to make sure that you have certain incentives, if you do sustainable sourcing and procurement, then it's the job for a conversation with the government. If you're looking to have this as a part of your own company strategy, there are existing ways to ensure, the international certifications and everything. But what we're hearing in this space as well is that sometimes the development is that some things simply don't have the internationally acknowledged standards. And that's where the work of the United Nations International Organization can step in. But it's not really much that I could say because I'm not quite sure which, and I think the organizers team already indicated that it would be really nice to understand which particular value chain are we talking about, where we want to have these procurement opportunities, because then it would be much more precise. But at a high level, I would have this answer.
Thanks, Pavel. And if Boaz is still on and wants to add that to the chat, maybe we can come back to it later. So here's one for you, I think, Megan. It's not specifically for you, but I'm asking you. It says, what type of investors are showing interest in these innovative finance mechanisms and what are they looking for?
So great question. So I think one of South Africa's most exciting, and I guess Africa's most exciting private sector investors, the suite of funds managed by climate fund managers. So Climate Investor 3 is a hydrogen-focused fund, which is really looking at the green hydrogen opportunity in South Africa and Namibia, and is stepping into the space where one might expect really only development finance institutions to play. So really looking at kind of the long-term industry outlook for what is expected to be an export competitive opportunity. So I think that's really important, and some of the other panelists have touched on it, is really where are the opportunities that are going to become commercially mature. I think Anna also highlighted that. So that's an exciting one. Beyond that, there are some new investment opportunities springing up around a much more difficult opportunity, which is around grid transmission and distribution networks that need to be upgraded to connect major manufacturers and miners with power. So typically technologies like solar and wind are not complete power solutions for heavier energy applications. So the grid does become important for industry. And there again, Climate Fund Managers is working on a concept, but also MEGA, so part of the World Bank Group, is coming into the space to offer guarantees to de-risk investment into transmission and distribution infrastructure. So I think investment opportunities at the moment are concentrated to a large extent around the southern tip of Africa and the northern tip of Africa, where manufacturing capacity and economies are the most stable. The part of the continent that I think has got the most exciting innovation opportunities is really East Africa, where newer energy transition value chains like electric motorbikes are taking off with quite limited policy support and broad-based kind of uptake across those economies. So they're far less dependent on kind of future demand and already showing signs of commercial maturity, which, kind of invite additional investment to scale up those sectors. So I think at the moment, very much still led by development banks like Fonera in Rwanda, but I expect to see a lot more private investor appetite in these the e-mobility value chains in East Africa.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see where things are going to develop in this next decade or two, as things are progressing in some parts of Africa so quickly at this point. Moving on to a question from Mohammed Armani. I'll ask this to you, Linda. He says, I work mostly in West Africa, and often conflicts emanate from natural resource and management. As such, resolving the underlying resource use conflicts are key to providing the foundation for transition to green value chains. I was wondering if the panel can weigh in a bit on approaches that work for resource use conflicts to provide a good basis for deploying green value chain interventions.
As EPP, in terms of supporting local resource use, as we engage developers, usually what we ask for is a use of the PREC revenues that are generated, and often engaging the local communities to be able to identify their priority areas helps a lot in guiding where that kind of investment will go, because the main electrification project is already in place, and therefore and you find that sometimes some of these conflicts, if you look at resources, for example, water is a major issue. You find that conflict sometimes is generated by competing of resources, and if these additional revenues that are available can be used to support the installation of multiple points of use, if it's for water infrastructure, then that in itself helps to solve cases like that. And so the approach that we take is engaging with developers who also extend that and reach out to the local communities. In some of these communities, you find that they form committees where they discuss and agree, these are our priority areas, and therefore come up with a solution that is found to be of most importance to the wider community, and that is what we support. And so I believe that our approach of engaging and getting feedback from the local community so that we have community-led solutions and not what we think they require, that in itself is one of the ways to start resolving those conflicts that often arise.
It looks like, Pavel, you would like to come in on this question. So I'll go over to you. Just before I do, I see a few hands going up, probably to ask questions. I think video and audio have been disabled for the audience in this webinar. So if you want to ask a question, you'll have to type it into the Q&A tab. Otherwise, you won't be able to. But please use that. Over to you, Pavel.
Yes, thank you. I'll be brief to leave the space for other questions, but addressing from Mr. Amani, I think we have to look at the consumption of these natural resources, where the consumption is happening, and how can you ensure that the consumer procures, again, responsibly and sustainably, and how to ensure that there is traceability of these natural resources that are being used. I mean, the textbook example for this one, right, is the Kimberley process for diamonds. The question is whether the same principle can be applied to things like copper or nickel. Sometimes the answer is not so positive, but if we can ensure that the consumer knows what they're consuming, and there's a clear traceability of where the resource comes from and how it's used, then you can place incentives on the consumer side to ensure that the resources that are used in the end products are sourced sustainably, thus reducing the questionable origins of these. But I mean, it's not a simple task. So of course, there are going to be many pitfalls along the way. But that, I think, is the approach that we should be considering. Back to you, Eleanor.
Thanks, Pavel. I don't think it's an easy question to answer, if I'm honest. But thank you to Linda and Pavel for trying to get somewhere with that one. I'm going to move on to a question specifically about Iraq now. So I will give it to you, Anna. But yeah, rest of the panel, always do raise up your hand, just as Pavel did, if you want to jump in. Groundwater salinization is most likely caused by overexploitation. Can technology alone solve this problem? And have you worked on governance as part of this?
Thanks, Eleanor, and thank you to whoever asked that question. Yes, so where we worked in southern Iraq, increasing water salinity was actually, to get a little bit into details, in the Shatt al-Arab as a result of high levels of consumption of that river water source, which then reduces the level of the river and moves the ocean water from the Gulf further up into Iraq's water supply. So here you're not only dealing with a technical challenge, and the desalination that we did was purely for agriculture purposes. So human consumption of water and desalination is far more expensive. For agriculture purposes, there are some locally feasible solutions. I absolutely agree that is not the ideal and best long-term solution. You're really looking long-term at large infrastructure projects to protect your freshwater resources, and things like floating blockades and other infrastructure can help to preserve and prevent that migration of the salt water into the country's freshwater sources. I think this is not something that our work on the Durable Communities and Economic Opportunities project intersected with, simply because we did not have the mandate to work at that national scale. There were others who were looking at it, and I think when we hear from like other panels like Megan as well, these are areas where organizations that work on critical infrastructure, national level resources can have the biggest impact, working with the regional and national government sources that have a lot to do in these areas. These are not small projects. They are, as Megan's PowerPoint illustrated, these are medium to long-term investments, and they require not only kind of a clear-eyed national vision, but then the capacity to mobilize the capital for that vision. There's a lot of really great people working on that, and I don't know at this point whether they've identified what solutions they have. For now, Iraq has really been focused overwhelmingly on increasing the water flow from neighboring countries and using that to kind of eliminate the problem of salinization in the fresh water. But long term, they definitely need to be looking at those other solutions, and it'll be interesting to see what comes up for that. But yeah, thanks for the question. Back to you, Eleanor.
Thanks, Anna. We are rapidly coming to the end of the time that we've got available for questions, but there are a couple of interesting ones still to look at in the chat. So there's one from Yusuf Pashtun in Afghanistan, which I'm going to ask all the panel to see if any of you got any ideas on how to respond to this or any experience. Question is, how can you start and promote greening value chains in conflict-affected and climate-affected countries where there isn't support of government? I feel like we've spoken a lot about engaging local government, local people, etc. But what about where there isn't support of government? And anybody want to put their hand up to tackle something around that? Megan.
Yeah, so happy to give it a go. I think, during the course of my career, spending the last 20 years in the finance space, developmental finance space, kind of working at the nexus between the commercial financial institutions and the public actors like development finance, I've noticed that more often than not, private sector is really the catalyst for change. And, in many instances, development finance institutions and even governments are following private sector demand for a product or a service. So, I think that critical minerals offer us an inherently robust source of market demand for something that is going to be critical to the global energy transition. So I think, as we've seen already in the last few months, there's a kind of geopolitical scramble over these minerals already as countries seek to kind of secure their strategic interests related to achieving the energy transition. So the fundamental is there. The fundamental kind of market forces are there. The private sector needs to secure these minerals to be able to manufacture the products required for energy transition. So I'm not so convinced that government needs to kind of create demand and stimulate these opportunities in the same way as it would have to for other more socially impactful or environmentally impactful opportunities that I'm more accustomed to working on. So I think the fundamentals are there. It's really about how investors can partner with corporates that represent the sources of demand and work around the sources of risk in these geographies through forming long-term partnerships with each other, but also with enablers in the environment like communities and these innovative finance institutions like the PREX team, which essentially are built to deal with the high risk in conflict-affected areas. That's my optimistic private sector view.
Thanks, Megan. Anna, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just very quickly here, I would say in these contexts, cooperation and collective action, bringing together different minds. I mean, if there are people that are interested in greening value chains locally in Afghanistan, I think like in any context, they benefit from coming together, sharing information, sharing insight. And then exactly as Megan said, aggregating that demand and taking it to an outside source or to another domestic source, and really finding kind of where the potentials are for action. So really working together is the key step to making that from an idea to an action. Back to you, Eleanor.
Thanks, Anna. And Linda, you've also got your hand up, so I'm going to bring you in here.
I just wanted to give an example, a practical example of where, adding on to what Megan has said, where private sector leads. So, for example, in Somalia, which has been, a similar case to what's happening in Afghanistan, working with the private sector, we've been able to issue PREX and supported, projects through private sector partnerships. And now what we see as a result of that and the publicity that comes out of it, you find that so the government then follows on and wants to learn what's happening there and then starts supporting. So, we, not being our own initiative, but after working with the private sector, then we were contacted by the government to be able to, and they wanted to understand what is this all about? How can we roll this out to other partners, other developers in the country? And so I think private sector leading the way sometimes also jolts the government to action. So, and that's from practical experience.
Thanks all. And I'm now going to hand back to Benedikt as we, I think, are running out of time now, and it'll be good to round things off. But yeah, thanks for being open to answer all those interesting questions, and thanks to those who have participated. Benedikt.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elle. You're really fantastic questions and discussion. I think for me, what today's conversation really made clear is that greening the energy value changes in conflict-affected context specifically, and in fragile context, is not just possible, it's really essential also. It's essential not just for delivering climate and development outcomes locally, but also for safeguarding the resilience of the global green transition itself, and for creating spillovers into the broader economy. And to do this successfully, we had a lot of great examples and food for thought. So taking a tailored context-specific approach, identifying real barriers on the ground, whether that's a skill gap, lack of trust in technology, or infrastructure bottlenecks. I think a really good case study from Anna on that. We need to root the value chains locally while linking them globally. And Pavel gave a really good overview on, on the PV case study in Nigeria, enabling facilitation of trade, creating jobs, and ensuring communities benefit from the transition and not just carrying the burden and implementing imported solutions. And then we need to put in place the right mix of regulatory and enabling infrastructure, policy certainty, etc., not only to build the value chains, but to catalyze their growth by de-risking investments and improving long-term revenue streams. And we must deploy innovative tools like peace renewable energy credits that are already proving effective in attracting capital and validating impact in high-risk environments. Well, it's a lot. It's not a simple solution. We know that, but it is possible. And in short, for me, greening these value chains isn't just about cleaner inputs. It's about building systems that are sustainable, inclusive, and stable from the ground up. So thank you, everybody, so much. Thank you to the fantastic panel. Really inspiring talks. Thanks to these thought-provoking questions from the audience, and well, most of all for your attention today. We're looking forward to continuing this important conversation during the third and I believe final webinar of this series, to be announced later. Elle?
Yeah, to be announced. And we'll also be, I think, sending out something as a kind of a summary of the session today as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much for attending, everybody, and have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.